Good evening, everyone, and welcome from New Canaan Library. I'm Anthony Maricola, Manager of Adult Services and Programming, and I hope you're all doing well. We have a really great program for you this evening, but before we start, tonight, Arianne Kolb and Michaela Porta are with us. Arianne Kolb has a Ph.D. in art history from USC and an M.A. from the Courtauld Institute of Art in London. She is a curator of old masters in modern art with recent exhibitions of contemporary Cuban art. She was a curator in the Paintings and Drawings Department of the Getty Museum, and her publications range from a book on the Flemish painter Jan Brueghel the Elder to children's books on Waveny and New Canaan architecture. She has been involved with Waveny for many years as a co-director of the Carriage Barn Arts Center and currently as a board member of the Waveny Park Conservancy. Michaela Porta is a freelance writer, editor, and curator specializing in cultural programming. She holds degrees in art history and English from Tufts University, was editor of Whitney Library of Design, an imprint of Watson Guptill Publications, and a principal of Engine Books, an editorial services provider focusing on architecture and design. Currently president of New Canaan Library's League of Women Voters, she works at New Canaan Library in materials management and as project lead on its Design for Freedom pilot with Grace Farms towards eliminating forced labor from the global construction supply chain. Tonight, they are with us to discuss artists and their patrons, Eberle, Johnston, and Waveny's Lapham legacy. This talk focuses on the exhibition, Women of Waveny, Artists, Patrons, and the Lapham Legacy, and explores and celebrates women's work in the creation of New Canaan's Waveny House and Park and beyond. The exhibit is on display until March 31st at the New Canaan Historical Society and Museum, so please visit it if you have not yet done so. Arianne and Michaela, thank you so much for being with us this evening.
Thank you, Anthony. Okay. This lecture highlights 5 remarkable women, 2 artists and 3 patrons whose lives spanned from 1864 to 2011 and who left their mark on the Waveny estate in New Canaan. This is Waveny House, built by Antoinette and Elise Lapham in 1914 and later maintained and gifted to the town by their daughter, Ruth Lapham Lloyd, with the final piece of the estate given by Elise Lapham, the widow of Ruth's nephew, David. The catalyst for the exhibition, Women of Waveny, currently on view at the New Canaan Museum and Historical Society until March 31st, was this sculpture in the fountain of Waveny's formal garden. The fountain hadn't been working for a while, and one day when it was finally fixed and being reinstalled, everyone was holding their breath. I noticed that it was signed Eberle. This was none other than Abastenia St. Eberle, one of the most acclaimed American bronze sculptors of the early 20th century, who even in her own time was included in the Metropolitan Museum of Art's permanent collection. We didn't know when this sculpture appeared at Waveny because photos of the garden taken when the grounds were being completed show the fountain without the sculpture. As it turns out, these photographs were taken in 1915 by Frances Benjamin Johnston, one of our more important documentary photographers of the early 20th century, and another groundbreaking female artist.
Then asked ourselves, how could we have missed these 2 women? These important and somewhat unconventional American artists whom we see here. Together with the Waveny patrons, we had 5 really talented, interesting women of vision, all quite different from each other, whose work contributed something meaningful and lasting that converges here at Waveny. In the early days of our research, we met with a scholar who was familiar with some of our subject matter, and we spoke with him enthusiastically about these artists and patrons whom we felt were significant. He listened politely and replied quite flatly that these were just women doing what women did, that it was all quite ordinary, really. His response shocked us momentarily, not only for what felt like the erasure of the women of Waveny, but also quite honestly, because we too felt diminished in a way that was as off-putting as it was oddly familiar. But it prompted us to think about the degree to which what he said was not true, that these women were in fact remarkable, and also the degree to which what he said was true, that these were just women doing what women did. We know women have always worked and worked with great competence and intelligence and joy, without permission or recognition. for the benefit of others and also for their own self-actualization. History tells us this, and our own experience verifies it, and it verified it in that moment, speaking with this expert. We saw how these women spoke to each other over space and time, got the job done and left a legacy, and yet had at times been overlooked or underrepresented, dismissed as dilettantes, housewives, or socialites. We began to think of their collective work as women's work, as important contributions in all the forms they take, which have built our communities, industries, and country, and are often hidden in plain sight. So for us, this was about investigating and celebrating these women and the centrality of women's work.
One second. Waveny was shaped during a fascinating and turbulent period of history and reflects the attitudes and developments of the beginning of the 20th century. Antoinette Lapham and her husband, Louis Henry Lapham, a co-founder of Texaco Oil, designed and developed Waveny House and the surrounding 400 acres as their country retreat. This formidable undertaking preoccupied them from 1907 to 1917. Antoinette, who disliked the existing Dutch colonial purchased from Thomas Hall, was instrumental in hiring well-known architect William Tubby to replace it with the Tudor Revival house we have today. These photos from their photo album shows the old house next to Waveny House being built. Once Waveny was finished, they tore down the old house. Ground was broken on April 11th, 1912, one day after the sailing of the Titanic, and the residence was completed by 1914, the year World War I began. The landscape design by the renowned Olmsted brothers was finished in 1917, the year that the US entered the war against Germany. During an era of political turmoil and technological advances, notably the design of the fastest and largest luxury passenger ship and the invention of the light bulb and airplane, the Laphams set about creating their own state-of-the-art, self-sufficient country estate with an extensive working farm, powerhouse, and even its own airstrip and hangar where the Lapham son Jack landed and housed his biplanes. Waveny House's imposing interior featured dark wood paneling, massive stone fireplaces, heavy sconces, medieval themed murals, and an impressive organ, lending it the appropriate nickname, the Castle. This is the library with a portrait of Louis Lapham. Antoinette commissioned the fashionable and prominent textile and tapestry design firm Herder Looms to decorate the walls of the main hall, hallways, and staircase. These vivid and charming murals depict jousting and hunting scenes. Herder also produced a custom-made tapestry for the niche above the dining room's fireplace dated 1914. Albert and Adele Herder, the founders of the firm, were painters who produced murals, paintings. They all adorned mansions and public buildings. Such here on the left is what is today the Al Hirschfeld Theater. And he also decorated the Los Angeles Public Library. And on the right is a portrait of Phyllis Decay painted by Adele. For the vast property, Antoinette and Louis hired and worked closely with the preeminent landscape design firm Olmsted Brothers, specifically John Charles Olmsted, the nephew and adopted son of Central Park's renowned designer Frederick Law Olmsted. This project involved a complex and lengthy design process in which the landscape views also determined the layout of the house. Here's one of the Olmsted plans. The entire estate exemplifies the country place style of the early 20th century with its winding roads, expansive lawns, woodlands, formal gardens, and farm groups consisting of Olmsted designed cottages, barns, stables, sheep pens, a poultry yard, vegetable garden, cornfields, and pastures. Antoinette, an avid gardener, directed the layout of the intricate plantings and formal gardens near the house with Percival Gallagher, who was part of the Olmsted firm. The gardens soon became the showcase for meetings of the Garden Club of New Canaan, which she co-founded in 1909 and led as its president from 1926 to 1928. Here is a photograph of their first flower show, and on the left is Antoinette. In 1918, a lotus fountain sculpture by Abastenia St. Eberle was commissioned by Antoinette to adorn the small lily pond as the centerpiece of these carefully designed formal gardens, and served as the only outdoor sculpture on the property. While Eberle was acclaimed by this time in New York with exhibits in top galleries such as Macbeth and two sculptures already acquired by the Metropolitan Museum, she did not focus on garden commissions, unlike some female contemporaries, and produced only one other fountain and a handful of decorative works. Commissioned by wealthy patrons, in this case Antoinette, such decorative projects did though help to financially support her genuine interest, which was actually the depiction of lower class immigrant women and children at work and play on the Lower East Side of New York. Her path to New York was quite extraordinary for a woman at the time. Eberle was born in Webster City, Iowa in 1878. Her mother was a piano teacher and her father was a doctor who actually lost his money in a speculative scheme. While she inherited her mother's musical talent, she decided after a local sculpture class at a YMCA in Canton, Ohio, that she wanted to pursue a career as an artist. In 1899, at the young age of 21, she traveled from Ohio to New York to begin her studies at the Art Students League with little money and no support from her parents, funding her studies and with scholarships and prizes and also teaching. This is really quite extraordinary, I find, at this time, turn of the century. Despite the challenges for women to become successful in the profession and even be allowed to compete for specific public commissions, a surprising number and small groups of American women made careers of their art in the early 20th century. Anna Hyatt Huntington was Eberle's first roommate, who eventually married the railroad heir. They collaborated on a prize-winning sculpture, and this here on the left is her Joan of Arc in New York City, and some sculpture of bears on her former estate, which is now Huntington Park in Reading, Connecticut. And I actually just discovered one of these casts of these sculptures as well in Westport. She has pieces all over. Janet Scudder focused on garden sculpture and worked with landscape designers such as the Olmsted. And on the right is a garden that's in Glen Cove, was also designed by the Olmsted brothers. And it was the Pratt estate, was called Welwyn. Pratt was also an oil industrialist, just like Elise Lapham. But this is what Scudder did. Scudder really focused on working with landscape designers. Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney, who later founded the Waveny Museum and acquired an Eberle for the museum, produced memorials and monuments such as this Daughters of the American Revolution Memorial, which is in Washington, D.C. Huntington and Whitney came from and married into wealthy families, whereas Eberle and Scudder did not. Therefore, it was necessary for Eberle to make a living from her exquisitely crafted sculptures, and she succeeded. Early on, Eberle, like some of her contemporary bronze sculptors, sold many casts of decorative utilitarian objects such as candlesticks, bookends, inkwells, and tobacco jars. Her Omar Khayyam bookends of 1913, which are in the show, are representative of these functional, like cleverly and exquisitely designed work. They were owned by Zalman Simmons, the wealthy founder of the Beauty Rest mattress, who had a large estate in Greenwich. In 1906, she created Girl Roller Skating, one of her first depictions of a child from the Lower East Side, setting the stage for the future direction of her socially conscious work. In 1909, a few years later, the Metropolitan Museum of Art acquired a cast of Girl Roller Skating, quite a coup for a young living artist. This sculpture, which is on loan from the Getty Museum for our exhibition, depicts a girl gliding on a single skate with outstretched arms and flowing hair. The girl's circumstances are evidenced by the articulation of her ragged dress and sagging stockings. Her wide open mouth suggests her screams of delight during this fleeting and liberating moment. In an interview with the Washington Post in 1916, Eberle described why daily urban scenes captivated her. She said, "The children of the East Side play without restraint. Their griefs and joys are expressed with absolute abandon. Their natural emotions are not restrained by the pretty curtsies taught by governesses. They laugh loudly, they shout, they race on roller skates and dance unrestrainedly. I can get at the human quality in these children. They are real, real as they can be. They express life." The skating girl does more than share her excitement. She embodies Eberle's own independent spirit and desire to thrive despite imposed social and economic constraints. The nobility of spirit of overlooked, invisible females inspired Eberle to monumentalize them in bronze. During the summer of 1907, she lived at the music school settlement on East 3rd Street, where she was in daily contact with children. She said, "I did not enter their neighborhood as a disturber, but to study them and the conditions under which they live, to be near them and to learn from them, to give help when I could and where I felt the need." She then rented an apartment on West 9th Street, where she continued to live amongst immigrants in order to study and model them. Eberle was not alone in her choice of subject at the time. The sculptor Mahonry McIntosh Young made a series of bronzes of Parisian laborers, which he exhibited together with Eberle's sculpture in Macbeth Gallery's show in 1914. Eberle's and Young's work parallel the social realist paintings by an American group called the Eight, also referred to as the Ashcan School. A member of this group, the painter George Lux, whose painting is on the right here, compassionately conveyed the sheer enjoyment that pure urban children took in quotidian activities. For Abastenia, her art served primarily as a social commentary on the underprivileged class. She humanized and elevated common, unremarkable females and recognized the value of their mundane work, caring for children, sweeping doorsteps. This sculpture of a woman sitting, on loan for the show from the New Britain Museum of Art, is captured by Eberle in the basic yet remarkably graceful act of dressing and slipping off her shoes after a hard day's work. No sculpture made more of a moralizing statement than her White Slave, which she exhibited at the renowned and sensational Armory Show of 1913. Its subject matter caused a stir even in the company of the stylistically groundbreaking European avant-garde artwork created by the likes of Picasso, Duchamp, Cézanne, and Matisse. These Picasso and Cézanne shows paintings were in the show. On the left is Picasso. And this is a show where also Duchamp's famous nude descending staircase was exhibited. Eberle's unsettling and unconventional work depicts a naked girl with her hands tied behind her back being auctioned off into prostitution by a vulgar, gesticulating man. She really accentuates his body movement and this hand that is sticking out in this intense manner. Eberle's technical virtuosity further informs the message. The girl's body is carefully and smoothly modeled, while the man's angular features and suit are harshly and roughly delineated. This disturbing and reactionary work exposed Eberle's intense agitation and concern about a growing crisis amongst the urban poor. Furthermore, it helped publicize the problem of forced prostitution amongst immigrants, and it was featured on the cover of the reform-oriented magazine, The Survey, which praised it as a sermon in stone. The same year that she conceived this powerful piece, she also produced Reclining Nude. This is also in the exhibition on loan from the Westmoreland Museum, a work that stands out in her oeuvre for its classical beauty and simplicity. Here she displays her academic training and ability to model the human form in all its perfection. At this point, Eberle was receiving critical acclaim and success, actively participating in numerous exhibitions. Her acquisition in 1913 of 2 tenements on West 13th Street, where she lived, worked, and rented apartments to other artists, further established her financial independence. She submitted her portrait, painted by her friend Stephen Haweis, when she was inducted into the National Academy of Design in 1921, where she often participated in shows, winning prizes, and was one of only 7 women ever to have been invited to become a member of the prestigious National Sculpture Society. This portrait was deemed unacceptable by the National Academy of Design and was replaced by this next portrait by Olinsky, much more traditional, showing her holding a sculpture. Contemporary reviews of Eberle's work attest to the unbiased appreciation of her talent and skill. It's interesting to note that a reviewer admired how she is as sensitively skillful as any great man sculptor. The previous portrait of Eberle that was rejected by the Academy, that is where it's the first time that it's ever exhibited in the exhibition, and it's on loan from the Conor Rosenkrantz gallery. By 1914, Eberle suddenly realized that her comfortable life on West 13th Street had propelled her away from her true calling to study the lower strata of society. The bourgeois gift of a tea wagon from a friend made her aware that she had become too complacent and distracted by producing portraits of respectable clients. This episode compelled her to rent a flat on Madison Avenue, a squalid, overcrowded immigrant neighborhood. She turned one of her rooms into a playroom with toys where children, such as this adorable girl eating grapes, on loan from the Woodstock Museum, could play in a safe place while she observed them as models. Her portrayal and advocacy of mainly lower class females was deeply rooted and is further reflected in her political activism, namely her involvement in the suffrage movement. She was a member of the Women's Political Union, which organized the first suffrage parade in 1910. Proudly carrying their banner, Eberle led a group of women sculptors in the New York suffrage parade in May 1911. She was influenced by the writings and social work of the reformer and suffragist Jane Addams, seen here, who championed women and children's welfare and founded Hull House, a settlement for women and a community center with an art studio in an immigrant neighborhood in Chicago. Eberle also co-curated a show with Adele Herder in 1915 at the Macbeth Gallery, which benefited suffrage, recruiting fellow female sculptors such as Janet Scudder to participate. This now brings me back to Waveny and the question that I was asking myself the whole time of how Eberle's sculpture ended up there, since she wasn't known for garden sculpture. The collaboration between Eberle and Adele Herder led me to believe that Adele is the likely connection between Eberle and Antoinette Lapham, since the Herders were decorating Waveny House at the same time. It's interesting that since Frances Benjamin Johnston photographed the Herders' house in East Hampton, seen here, around 1915, it is probable that Adele suggested she photograph the Waveny Gardens that same year. So all these women were definitely talking to each other and making things happen and helping each other out. By the early 1920s, Eberle's artistic efforts begin to slow down prematurely due to a heart ailment. Her first one-person retrospective, which was also her last, celebrated the women and children of the Lower East Side at the Macbeth Gallery. Her close friend, Virginia Hart, often lived with her during this difficult time. This exquisite bust of Virginia's daughter, Anne, which is in the show, exemplifies the intimate quality of her works and the delight Eberle took in studying children's uninhibited behavior and expressions. By modeling the head of this unkempt and smiling girl without her neck and shoulders, she provides the small work which one can hold in one's palm with striking immediacy and tenderness. One almost sees a bit of a resemblance to the nymph at Waveny, in the Waveny fountain sculpture. Perhaps she was the model for that as well. Despite her illness, Eberle still managed to produce a few other small sculptures and one other fountain for the Harkness estate at a barn she purchased in Westport, Connecticut, not far from the Waveny nymph.
Johnston was very different from Eberle, but during her lifetime, she was also a successful artist, a name that was known and sought after, and yet not a household name today. Following the opening of our exhibition, the New York Times ran this piece on her. It's one of their overlooked obituaries, which we promptly sent to our local press with a note saying that we had broken the story first. Unlike Eberle, Johnston was born in 1864 to a distinguished family, which was later based in Washington, D.C. Her father worked for the Treasury, and her mother was, unusually for her time, a political journalist for the Baltimore Sun. When Johnston wanted to study art, they sent her to the Académie Julian in Paris, which accepted women when the Académie des Beaux-Arts still did not. Now remember, women still couldn't vote in the United States, yet Johnston, who was not a political activist like Eberle, was privileged and raised in a way that took for granted she could do whatever she wanted to do. She trained as a serious painter, but also seriously loved a good party. Impressionism was the exciting movement happening in art at the time, but Johnston favored the more classical style. This was a split in her personality, the traditional alongside the forward thinking, and it was a quality that ran through her persona and her work for her whole life. Here she is in these playful self-portraits. She's gender bending on the left, and on the right, she's viewed as an independent new woman holding a cigarette and a tankard of beer and showing her petticoat. She's standing in front of the mantel of her studio. And on the mantel are portraits of friends whom she felt were culturally significant in her day. Even though she sincerely advocated photography as a career for women in lectures and writing and by curating exhibitions of women photographers, no women seemed to find their way onto her mantel that day. She opens her studio with help from her parents when she returns from Paris. And now magazines are booming, so she starts her career as an illustrator. Photography, however, was beginning to take the place of illustrations with the advent of dry plates in the 1870s and film in the 1880s. So Johnston sees this as the future and gets in early. She sent an inquiry about photography to George Eastman, the head of Kodak in Rochester, New York, whom we think might have been a family friend. And he sent her a camera, and she was off and running. She had a great eye for composition and a keen desire to work and support herself financially. And she began her artistic and commercial career in photography by doing portraits. Because of her family's connection to influential, powerful people, she had no shortage of sitters, and many were not unlike herself. Interesting, creative women like Charlotte Perkins Gilman, a writer and social reformer, Natalie Barney, the playwright, poet, and novelist who moved to Paris and lived openly as a lesbian. Mary Berry Chapman Hansbrough, an American poet and painter. Johnston photographed 5 presidential administrations, including her family friend Teddy Roosevelt, whom she captures here before his days in the White House in his Rough Rider uniform, which he was extremely happy to model for her. She was seriously good. Her classical training shows in her well-constructed images that seem to tell a story. There's a narrative implicit in them that appeals to both the subject and the viewer. This iconic shot of Booker T. Washington from 1895 is gorgeous. It's reproduced so often, I'm sure many of you know it and didn't realize it was Johnston's. I like to use this image to show how she quite organically moves between portraiture and documentary photography. The dignity and gravitas of this image, its warmth and humanity tell a story. And Washington recognizes this talent in Johnston. He hires her because he wants her to convey the significance of the work happening at the Tuskegee Institute, the academic and vocational school he founded to train Black teachers. An image like this is not only worth 1,000 words, it's so well done, it's worth thousands of dollars. Washington's intention was to have images like this attract donors to the cause. By now, Johnston, who is well-educated and worldly and charmingly eccentric, has realized that when she's chatting with her sitters and learns something about them, she can make more money by adding those bits of information to her pictures. She always maintained that her images spoke for themselves and didn't require captions, but was always looking for a way to better sell her work, to get more mileage out of a job. She goes on assignment and also pitches images to magazines, like these women working here in a shoe factory, this exquisite picture of miners on the Mesabi Range, workers in a wooden box factory. And through Teddy Roosevelt, she gained access to Admiral Dewey and his Navy ship, the USS Olympia, in 1899, just returning from their victory in Manila Bay in the Spanish-American War. Johnston is welcomed aboard and allowed to capture the behind-the-scenes lives of sailors passing the time on their ship. Now, throughout the late 19th century and early 20th century, while Johnston works feverishly to keep growing as an artist and career woman, there's a movement in photography called the photo secession, led by Alfred Stieglitz. And he and other photographers who identify as pictorialists are calling for the elevation of photography to the same level as painting or sculpture. Stieglitz looks down on Johnston's work as commercial, but she was undaunted. She had confidence in her work, and Stieglitz did publish, if grudgingly, 2 of her pictures and camera notes, the most important photography journal of the time, which he edited. Ironically, Stieglitz's painterly approach, which you can see here in his famous image of the Flatiron Building in New York, is at odds with Johnston, who thought straight photography was art. In other words, that a picture didn't have to look like a painting to be taken seriously. Interestingly, other pictorialists from the photo secession, like Edward Steichen, did commercial work as well, and yet weren't scrutinized in the same way by Stieglitz. A big shift in her work comes when Johnston exploits her remarkable ability to capitalize on the changing zeitgeist. Here's a shot of the Macmillan Commission, the architects and designers at work creating the Washington Mall. This was part of the City Beautiful movement, advanced by architects like Charles McKim and the landscape architect Frederick Law Olmsted, who believed in civic and moral virtue through beautification. Johnston first learned about these ideas when she participated in the World's Fair in Chicago in the late 19th century. It was a movement that appealed to her because it combined tradition with progress. Again, that dichotomy in her. And she moves on it at the turn of the century in her next phase, architecture and garden photography. At this time, the cities were shedding people to the suburbs, and the wealthy were building estates and gardens reproduced in architecture and garden magazines. In the beginning of this new trend, what was significant about an image was what was being pictured. In other words, a prize-winning photo in a garden magazine had won because it showed the most beautiful feature or flower, and the photographer barely got a mention. Again, this didn't trouble Johnston. She knew what she was, and her discerning eye and sense of composition kept her busily employed. And the genre would soon gain in prestige, so that photographers also gained in notoriety. These images with the black border are glass lantern slides, embellished by hand by a colorist, and these were produced with her lover, photographer Mattie Edwards Hewitt, who lived from 1869 to 1956. Johnston and Hewitt had a personal, intimate relationship, as well as a professional one, and then went their separate ways. While Johnston was never vocal about her sexuality, I couldn't find any evidence that she'd ever hidden the relationship with Edwards either. Here again, not an open advocate, but nevertheless living life her way. Johnston continued to be sought after by important clients. This was the Samuel Knopf house, built circa 1913. It no longer exists, but Samuel, who as a boy immigrated from Poland, made money from a career in banking and headed his own ad agency, and was the father of Alfred Knopf, founder of the prestigious publishing house of which Samuel became treasurer. Tudor Place was originally the home of Martha Custis Peter and Thomas Peter. Martha was granddaughter of Martha Washington and step-granddaughter of George Washington. Thomas was the son of the first mayor of Georgetown. Tudor Place is not only still with us, it's one of the nation's first National Historic Landmarks. So Johnston had not only bought into City Beautiful, but also Garden Beautiful, reminding her audiences of their obligation to create beautiful landscapes by quoting the 19th century writer and art critic John Ruskin, who said that the exterior of your house is not private property. And in this ad that she placed for her own lectures, she reminds audiences what they can expect from her. And I quote, "A course unique from 2 points of view, the artistic and practical. As a pictorialist, Miss Johnston excels. Her exquisitely colored slides are great doors flung open on ravishing prospects, not prosaic records of a camera," end quote. So that's her way of saying, take that, Stieglitz. And she's basically telling you she's an artist who's also for hire. She was popular on the garden lecture circuit, the well-born traditionalist whose deep culture and bohemian panache thrilled refined audiences. She cleverly planned her engagements so that for every lecture she gave, she tried to photograph houses and gardens for clients in the same trip. And by the way, the image on the right of this slide is Waveny House, which she uses here as an example of our American gardens. So this shrewdness and her fine-tuned instinct for reinvention led her to the next and final chapter of her career, architecture photography that was focused on preservation in the American South. Following the stock market crash in 1929, images of wealthy, showy estates had fallen out of favor. She pivots with a grant from the Carnegie Corporation to document old buildings in the South that were in danger of disappearing. She travels with her assistant, Huntley Ruff, an African-American, during a time when the South is very much segregated. Johnston and Ruff are close, yet she's a member of the DAR, the same organization that would prevent opera singer Marian Anderson, who was also Black, from performing at Constitution Hall in 1939. Incidentally, thanks to Eleanor Roosevelt, who resigned from the DAR over this, Anderson ended up singing for 75,000 people at the Lincoln Memorial, and many years later was invited by Ruth Lapham Lloyd to come to Waveny. But let's just imagine Johnston making her way through Virginia and the Carolinas, Georgia, Florida, Alabama, Mississippi, with Huntley Ruff, raising eyebrows wherever they went, but Johnston at least appeared unconcerned. She would later bequeath money to Ruff in her will, even as she left out many of her friends. They went all over, shooting everything from grand estates and civic buildings to humble houses and sheds, and made 7,500 negatives as Johnston continued to lecture. Only now it was about preservation to the same kinds of cultivated audiences as before, but now she also reached out to ordinary people, trying to bring them on board with preservation. Her images were critically acclaimed, not just by preservationists, but also in the art world, and she had a major show at the Smithsonian in 1937. When World War II gas rationing made it hard for Johnston to keep working and Ruff was called away to active duty, she started planning for old age. Johnston was already 56 in 1920 when women won the right to vote. She was born during the Civil War and died after the introduction of television, had navigated overwhelming cultural change to stay one step ahead and get on with her work. In 1945, she buys an old house in New Orleans's French Quarter, and in the back clears the way to make her first ever garden, where she's photographed here with New Orleans photographer Joseph Woodson Pops Weitzel, who lived from 1876 to 1958 and was a central figure of French Quarter Bohemia and the French Quarter Renaissance. It was here that Johnston lived out her life and organized her archive for the Library of Congress.
Waveny, beautifully photographed and documented by Johnston in this glass lantern slide, is also the result of the inspirational vision of Ruth Lapham Lloyd to preserve her family estate as New Canaan's town park and treasure. Ruth, the daughter of Louis and Antoinette Lapham, grew up in New York City and summered at Waveny. In 1940, Ruth and her own immediate family moved there permanently, and when Antoinette died in 1956, Ruth inherited the family estate. An avid equestrian, Ruth pursued her hobby on the property's extensive wooded trails. Her father's performances on their organ probably inspired Ruth's passion for music. A trained singer, Ruth made some recordings and often performed classical music, accompanied by her pianist at concerts at Waveny and even at Carnegie Hall, where she had a studio. This photo here shows Ruth at the pool at the left with her pianist, who is also in the photo on the right in a canoe with Ruth's son, the actor Christopher Lloyd, who grew up here. They used to love spending time. He used to love spending time in the pond. Ruth became one of New Canaan's most significant benefactors, often referred to as its guardian angel. In 1966, she donated the land for the current New Canaan High School, and in 1967, she entrusted Waveny to the town of New Canaan with the intention of it becoming a park. This photo from the New Canaan Advertiser shows her dancing at the town celebration. She was a driving force behind the establishment of Waveny Care Center, helped launch the Powerhouse Theater and the Carriage Barn Arts Center. In the end, her dream of Waveny as a resource for education, health services, and the arts was indeed fully realized. Ruth's impact, though, went well beyond Waveny. She funded the Lewis H. Lapham wing of the New Canaan Library and financed projects at the New Canaan Historical Society. In 1974, she established a generous endowment for the Metropolitan Museum of Art that to this day allows it to remain open 2 nights a week. Originally, it was so that it could be open on Tuesday nights, but now it's actually Thursday and Friday nights. It's on the left is a Chanel suit that Ruth, from about 1963, that Ruth donated to the Costume Institute in 1984. Ruth recognized the enduring impact her contribution could make to the preeminent arts institution, even though she wasn't an art collector. And it's wonderful that this is where the artist who created her beloved fountain sculpture, which she nicknamed Gwendolyn, had the sculpture of a girl roller skating on permanent display. Elise Lapham carried on Antoinette's legacy with her love of gardens and nature conservation and helped complete the vision of Ruth's ideal function of Waveny. Elise was a conservationist and ornithologist who was involved with community organizations such as the Garden Club of New Canaan and the New Canaan Land Trust, which she co-founded. Elise was married to David Lapham, the nephew of Ruth and grandson of Antoinette. After World War II, they lived on the Waveny estate in the bungalow, a model of which you see here on the left that she's looking at with some friends. This bungalow was the summer house built in 1915 by William Tubby for David's father, Jack Lapham. He wanted his own place. In 1996, Elise donated the bungalow to the town and helped found the Lapham Community Center. We conclude now our talk with Robert Peterson's print of Waveny from 1994, which poignantly conveys its intricate history, highlighting the fundamental role of the Lapham women. Located in the center of the piece near an early photo of the original carriage barn are Antoinette and Ruth's names in spidery longhand, the artwork's nearly invisible beating heart. Peterson also included a vintage postcard of Eberle's fountain. All these women and their work are recognized and woven into the fabric of the collage print. With research and photographs from the New Canaan Historical Society, Peterson made this edition for an exhibition at the Carriage Barn while he was living briefly in Silvermine. His approach recalls the work of one of the most important modern artists, Robert Rauschenberg, as it turns out, with whom Peterson closely collaborated for 20 years. Here on the right is a photo of Peterson and Rauschenberg. Nearly 80 years after the completion of Waveny, the story and legacy of its female patrons and artists made a lasting impression and still resonate with so many today. We hope that if you haven't done so, you'll come see the exhibition during these last 2 weeks. It's on view until the end of March. Thank you so much. If anybody has any questions now, you can.
Oh, thank you. That was wonderful. So we do have some questions, and I'll start with the first one. It said that Johnston studied in Paris while Eberle studied in New York. Did Eberle travel at all to Europe or study there later, like the other artists of her era?
That's an interesting question because it shows a lot the differences between Eberle and Johnston. Johnston coming from this privileged background, even like, you know, being able to go to Paris. Some of Eberle's contemporary female artists also either studied sometimes abroad or even were apprentices to famous sculptors in Paris. So, but in Eberle's case, you know, as we know, she was lucky to get herself to New York. But interestingly, in 1907, she decides to go to Naples because she wanted to go to a specific foundry there. She was really, as you can see, you know, technique was very important to her. The whole process was of, you know, the lost wax method was she was very particular about it, mainly worked with this one foundry in New York. But she goes to Naples as a young woman all on her own. This is kind of unheard of. And she got a lot of looks in Italy at the time and in Naples. But she actually ended up going back again a year later and had about 20 sculptures cast there. But eventually the whole community and the neighborhood, they began to accept her after a while because they realized that this woman really had talent. But she early on, I mean, she just right away, it didn't, as we saw with the girl roller skating, after a few years being in New York and studying, she was a master, you know, at sculpting in bronze.
Thank you. The next question reads, is it possible to tour inside the Waveny house in the gardens?
Yes, it is. Mickey, if you ever want to jump in. Yes, it is. It's everything is accessible. We encourage everyone. You know, we sort of had a reproduction of the Herder looms, painted murals and the wallpaper, and you can go in, you can see that tapestry over the fireplace, which was just restored by the Preservation Alliance. And yeah, you can absolutely go inside and see it. It's important to see it, to understand it more. And the gardens are all accessible, and one should absolutely now, when you go into the formal gardens, now take a closer look. We want everyone to recognize that the fountain is by such a significant artist. And it's wonderful because a lot of scholars who we have met with and who have been involved in this whole project and the research, they never knew about the fountain. Nobody really knew that this fountain was by Eberle. So it was quite an exciting discovery for, you know, for everyone and for scholars.
Thank you. The next question reads, Ruth Lapham Lloyd created an endowment for the Met when she herself did not collect art and was mainly interested in music. How did that endowment come about?
Yeah, so it was interesting. I happened to find out about it from her son, Christopher Lloyd. He had an old sort of a plaque commemorating and recognizing her endowment and this trust. And he wasn't sure, you know, how it came about. And I knew in the 70s, I was trying to think, well, who was the director at the time? Thomas Hoving. He was the kind of master of the first blockbuster art exhibition, King Tut, all that. That was all what he did. But I thought, you know, he said, no, he seemed to have had an accent. So all I could think of was Philippe de Montebello, who was the next director and probably one of the most important directors of the Met ever. I happened to run into him at an event where he was being honored. And I asked him about Ruth Lapham Lloyd, and he said, yes, indeed, he was the one who had courted her, cultivated her, and eventually got her to donate it because he told her she could make a difference. And this was in the 70s. And she said, I can make a difference. And he said, yes, you can actually make a big difference. And it's wonderful that she did. And because it just didn't seem to make sense. She's so involved with Carnegie Hall. Why is she, what motivated her to give to the Met? But it's lovely that there's, sculpture by Eberle on. I wonder if she was aware of that, because I doubt they were aware. I'm not sure if she was even aware who the artist was. I don't think she was that interested in art. Usually these houses of this period, this is sort of Gilded Age. Her family, or they had they had, token paintings. This kind of wealth, you'd have a token impressionist, a Monet or something. They didn't have any of that. She had 2 portraits of herself, and they're okay. They're by more local artists, and there's a portrait of her father, but they're not masterpieces by at all.
That's interesting that they didn't have, and that the one that they did have, the one piece of sculpture was by Eberle and not by not by Scudder or one of the other sort of, like the ones that everybody knows of. I'm curious, Arianne, when we started this, you kind of felt one way about Eberle, and like your feelings for her grew. Today we were talking about it, and you said, I'm really going to miss her when this show closes on the 31st. I'm really going to miss her. She's so special. Can you just say a little bit more? You talked about some of the other women sculptors of her time, but do you want to just say, personally, like why you think she's so special?
Well, I think she's special. And actually, it just so happens that today I was looking at the sculptures in the gallery with someone who was extremely helpful putting this exhibition together, Joel Rosenkrantz, who is the leading, art dealer in American sculpture, and especially of this period. And no, he agreed that I said, does she really stand? She's really unique. She's really unique. All these other artists, Scudder, Whitney, Huntington, they're interested in different genres, and they tend to more, and a lot of us associate sculpture with sort of these outdoor monumental pieces, but this is Eberle's pieces. If you haven't been to the exhibition, because sometimes it's hard to tell the scale from these slides that we've been looking at. So if you come, you'll see they're not very big, and her children you can hold them in your hand. They're tiny. These are very intimate pieces. They're very special. And while I showed Young's works of Parisian laborers, it's different. And her focus on women and girls is unique, absolutely unique. You have someone like Degas, who is depicting ballet dancers. But this is something very different, and she's very special in the way she championed women, and not only in her art, but she actually practiced what she preached, her involvement in the suffrage movement. This was her mission, and she realized it when she came to New York, that this was something that she really wanted to express the dignity, the beauty of their spirit. And it's quite remarkable. And it's incredible the way she does it in bronze, to be able to do that, to show
Thank you. So we do have one last question. What was your selection process like? Did you have any issues with lending institutions or any pieces that you would have liked to show that you weren't able to?
That's a really funny, that is such a funny question, because we actually did, we were all ready to go with this show. And had worked everything out, all the loan agreements, the art shipping, the art installation, you know, it was a lot. And we were set to open in time for the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment. So this was going to be a show celebrating, you know, not just the 100 years of women voting, but just women, you know, art, history, all of it. Everything was set. And then COVID happened. And literally from one day to the next, we were just shut down. And so all of those arrangements that had been made were put on pause. And we thought, well, maybe, you know, in a month or 2 months or 6 months or 8 months, you know, and then everything kind of had to be redone. And the craziest thing was that, you know, one of the pieces, the piece you're seeing here, Girl Roller Skating, we had to borrow from RISD because the Met's is always on, it's on permanent exhibition, so they can't loan it. So we borrowed it from RISD, and I'll let Arianne explain the process for receiving that, building the case, installing that piece. It was a lot. It was really involved. You were there.
Yeah, it was a lot. Yeah, no, it was interesting because so Nancy Geary, the director of the Historical Society, she has rebranded it to become the New Canaan Museum. And when I was sort of researching all this and doing a bit of research at the Historical Library, we were talking about what all this was. And I just thought, gosh, it'd be so ideal to do an exhibition somewhere. And she said, well, I have this new gallery space upstairs. And you know, so I was like, well, let's see first, you know, what's involved. An exhibition, a loan exhibition like this is very expensive. And since the pandemic, shipping, transportation costs have doubled, if not sometimes tripled. But so the first place I went obviously was the Metropolitan, to the curator, Thayer Tolles, to see, you know, about this piece, discuss this with her. Does this seem like a good idea even? And she was, and other scholars were just thought, absolutely, this is so important. This will be wonderful to reunite some of her sculptures. And as Mickey said this, she said, I can't lend it, it's on permanent display. But as you know, there's a cast in the Whitney Museum of it. There's a cast at RISD Museum. So RISD, the curator, loved the idea and right away said, yes, I'll recommend it to the director. We would love to be involved in this exhibition. And then it kind of went from there. And then Joel Rosenkrantz was very, very helpful in just saying, you know, quite a few, we were talking, quite a few pieces have gone through his gallery and ended up in private collections or museums. So he was very helpful in kind of helping to get those loans. It's a tricky process, and you know, it's expensive to put on a show, a loan show.
Tricky is, you're being modest. I mean, tricky is, you know, building the case.
Yeah, it's a lot. This was the big installation. RISD was we spent hours on a Zoom call with them, making sure we installed it precisely the way they wanted it. We had one sculpture that it's weeks before the show, and we are not hearing from the private collector. We're not hearing back, and thinking why. She said she was going to do it. And it turns out, you know, she had a death in the family, and you know, had so much to deal with, and we've literally got the sculpture, the little sculpture of Anne Hart at like the last minute. And it's interesting because that was in the Rosencrantz Gallery when I first met with Joel, and a few months later, he had
was
sold it.
sold.
And I was so anxious about, well, but I thought it's going to be in our show. And he said, don't worry. She's a lovely person. The collector would love to be in an exhibition. So, there are all these, there were quite some funny stories.
Logistics.
With the
Logistics
logistics and the
involved.
loans but it's a lengthy process, insurance, condition reports, everything. There's a lot involved in a loan exhibition, but we are happy to have gotten this lovely grouping of sculptures together. So anyway.
Thank you, Arianne, Michaela, thank you so much for being with us this evening. It's been such a pleasure, and you've really
Our
done
pleasure.
you've done an incredible job with this exhibit. It's still showing until March 31st. So if you haven't seen it, please see it. It's basically in your backyard, so you should please see it. New Canaan community, thank you as well for spending your evening with us. I wish everybody a wonderful rest of evening, and I hope to see you all again soon. And thank you both again.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So much, Anthony. This was
Good
great.
night.
Good night.